It's in PowerPoint, I know. But it's the only thing I know. It's the only thing I know. Well, hi everyone. My name's Thomas, and I've got some mildly interesting information for you today. So buckle up your britches, because I'm about to make you my students today. So picture, if you will, Shakespeare. Ah, yeah, Shakespeare. Macbeth. Hamlet. A Midsummer Night's Dream. A true poet of a classic era of literature. Many of you know Shakespeare so well that you can actually tell that this is Samuel de Champlain and that this is Shakespeare. Why do we know this? We know a direct object isn't a direct object pronoun, and we know a rhythm from a rhyme, but why? Well, unless you were weird, it was probably because someone taught you English language arts at some point. So, where do you think the first of these classes were performed? I'll give you a second. Nope. Put those frolicking Dickensian scamps aside because they were actually in India. So, the year was 1835, and the East India Company was in control of most of India following the Third Anglo-Maratha War, destroying the last resistance of the Marathi Empire. So the East India Company was obligated to spend a certain portion of their funds on education within the British Indian colonies. And this kind of makes sense considering they were also being paid to, conquer them. And the strategy that they would often use is just to pump funds into existing educational institutions. And this had a benefit of actually keeping traditional Muslim and Hindu teachings intact. And, they had Orientalism was the main school of thought, and they had their own traditional teachings, and then the English just kind of tacked their stuff onto it like a tumor. But this was not to stay, not for too long, because the colonial mindset was really beginning to sink in, and it all came to a head in 1835, specifically the head of Thomas Babington Macaulay. Now, if you get a chance to read his minute, you should, because it perfectly outlines the mindset of the British at the time. I'm gonna wrinkle some paper and bust out my British accent. All parties seem to be agreed on one point, that the dialects commonly spoken among the natives in this part of India contain neither literary nor scientific information, and are moreover so poor and rude that, until they are enriched from some other quarter, it will not be easy to translate any valuable work into them. It seems to be admitted on all sides that the intellectual improvement of those classes of the people who have the means of pursuing higher studies can at present be effected by only means of some language not vernacular amongst them. So in case you missed any of that, he's basically saying that their method of education is inferior, and that if they want to produce thinkers on the level of the British, they gotta teach them British and the British language. So, believe it or not, there is some good in there. He states that the strength of their language laid in the vast collection of Eastern poetry, and that because of this, the study of great English poetry would help them transition faster into being English speakers. Now, this type of thought is rooted in cognitivist thinking, and if it hadn't been for the ultimate goal of assimilation, this would have been a great way to teach English across a cultural divide by connecting bodies of literature. He stresses that English will be very important to their lives and present the Indian citizens with opportunities not otherwise available. English was the language of the archive, the trade, and the science at the time. He posits that Britain stood only to gain from granting intelligent individuals access to modern science. Certainly, these last two were true, as even today English is the main language used in international negotiations, and we know what happens to countries who suppress access to science, and we also know how quickly technology is moving forward as more and more people from across the world have access to this growing global network of knowledge. In all, his speech contains glimpses of the bright future of education, but underneath a thick veneer of the white man's burden. So, Regardless of whether or not he truly cared about the well-being of Indian citizens, the English Education Act of 1835 introduced a new curriculum of English vernacular education, which contained lessons of English grammar, poetry, and literature. Later officials would challenge this curriculum, arguing that British funds needn't go teaching them British cultural attitudes, maybe just the language. Maybe the language was all they needed. And while these schools were initially about as fun as you think when you put, colonial British and education in the same sentence, the East India Company eventually had to relinquish control of India to the government of Britain. And at this time, the government of Britain funded the traditional schools and the British schools equally. Unfortunately, I do have to mention that at the time, it was still only the rich in India who could afford education, and it wouldn't be until 1950 that the Republic of India passed into inauguration, and this actually made education free for the entire population. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something out of this. I certainly did, and it's cool to see that how far modern language arts have come since their, colonial and rather white supremacist beginnings. So, thanks.